The wind screamed through the endless expanse of ice and snow, cutting through layers of fabric and flesh alike. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of relentless, bone-deep freeze that could steal the breath from your lungs and turn a living body into a frozen corpse in mere hours. And Saran was barely holding on. The little girl clung to her mother's unmoving form, her small fingers digging into the stiff, frost-covered fabric of Ellis's coat. Her body shook violently, though whether it was from fear or the creeping embrace of the cold, she could no longer tell. The snow piled around them, swallowing their tracks, erasing any sign that they had ever existed. Soon, it would erase them too. She pressed her forehead against her mother's shoulder, willing her to wake up. "Please, please, please." Her tears slipped down her cheeks, freezing almost instantly against her violet skin. The stinging cold of them barely registered anymore. Her mother had stopped answering her minutes ago, maybe longer. Saran wasn't sure. Time had lost all meaning in this endless storm. She sniffled, curling in on herself, trying to burrow into what little warmth remained in her mother's unmoving body. She had promised they would make it. She had promised they would find safety, that they would escape. The men had come for them at dawn, armed, relentless, their voices sharp, barking commands in a language Saran barely understood. Her mother had grabbed her hand, whispered a single word: "Run." They had run through the jagged ridges of ice, through the thin air that burned their lungs, through exhaustion, fear, and the crushing weight of knowing they had nowhere left to go. And now there was only this. The wind howled louder and Saran squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to die here. Then through the storm a shape moved. She almost didn't believe at first, thought it was some cruel trick of her frozen mind, but then it came closer. A hulking shadow against the swirling snow, tall, broad, wrapped in heavy, unfamiliar armor. A stranger. Saran stiffened, her small fingers curling into her mother's sleeve. Her breath came in short, rapid bursts, her heart hammering against her ribs. One of them? Have they found them after all? The figure stopped a few feet away, standing still as if assessing the scene before him. He raised a hand and pressed something on his helmet. With a soft hiss, the visor retracted, revealing a human face. Saran froze, too terrified to even breathe. She had never seen one up close before. Humans were dangerous, that was what her mother had always said. Wild, unpredictable creatures, brutal and unrelenting, leaving ruin in their wake. The elders spoke of them in hushed, weary voices. Their ways were strange, unnatural. They didn't follow the balance of things. Saran had believed those stories, but this human, he didn't look like a monster. His face was rough, lined with exhaustion and something else she didn't quite understand. His dark eyes flickered between her and her mother, sharp and assessing, not cruel, not cold, but searching. Then he moved. Saran flinched, instincts screaming at her to run, fight, do something, but her limbs refused to obey. He crouched beside them, reaching out, and for one agonizing second, she thought he was going to take her, snatch her up like the men in the dark uniforms had tried to do. Instead, his gloved fingers barely brushed against her mother's throat. His jaw tightened. "She's still breathing." His voice was rough, deep, almost lost in the wind. Saran's chest ached. She wanted to believe him, but what if it was a trick? "I can help." She didn't understand why those words made something inside her crack. Her hands trembled as she clutched her mother's sleeve, torn between everything she had been taught and the desperate, instinctive need for someone, anyone, to save them. The human's gaze flickered to her, meeting her wide, tear-filled eyes. His expression shifted, something like understanding flashing across his face. He hesitated, then did something Saran hadn't expected. He pulled off his glove. The wind bit into his skin immediately, turning his fingers red, but he didn't flinch. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and offered her his hand. Not a demand, not a command, a choice. Saran stared at it, her own small hands curled into fists against her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to be wary, to hold back, to never trust a human. But beneath the fear, something else whispered. He didn't have to stop. He didn't have to kneel in the snow. He didn't have to reach out at all. Her breath shuddered. Her mother had told her to be brave. Tears slipping silently down her cheeks, Saran reached out, hesitant, barely touching his fingers at first. His skin was warm despite the cold. Rough, solid, real. The man let out a slow breath, then with steady, careful movements, he scooped Ellis into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He shifted her against his chest, securing her as best he could. Then he turned back to Saran. "Come on, kid." His voice was quieter now, like he knew how fragile she felt. "We need to get out of here." Saran hesitated only a second longer, then she grabbed the edge of his coat, holding on tight. The man nodded once, his grip firm around Ellis. He turned, walking forward into the storm, his powerful strides cutting through the snow like it was nothing. Saran followed. The storm raged around them, but she no longer felt like she was being swallowed whole. And for the first time in her life, she wondered. Maybe the stories were wrong. The storm had not relented. If anything, it had grown fiercer, clawing at them with icy fingers, howling in frustration, as if enraged that its prey was slipping away. The human, Kevin, moved steadily, his strides unwavering despite the snow rising past his knees. He carried Ellis against his chest with an ease that seemed impossible, as if her weight meant nothing to him. Saran clung to his coat, her small hands grasping the heavy, unfamiliar fabric like a lifeline. She didn't know where they were going. She wasn't even sure this man knew, but he moved with purpose, like someone who had already decided they were going to survive. That was something, at least. Her feet ached, half numb from cold, but she kept moving, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because stopping meant dying. And even though she didn't understand this human, she knew one thing for certain. He was her only chance. The wind shrieked one last time before they finally broke through the worst of the storm. A dark shape loomed ahead, an outpost, partially buried in the ice, its entrance a reinforced metal hatch barely visible against the landscape. Kevin shifted Ellis in his arms and reached for a device on his wrist. A moment later, the door hissed open, flooding the snow with dim, artificial light. The heat inside hit Saran like a physical blow. Her skin burned as warmth tried to chase the frost from her body, her lungs stinging as she inhaled air that wasn't freezing for the first time in hours. Kevin stepped inside, and the door sealed shut behind them with a finality that made her shiver. The sudden silence was overwhelming. The howling wind was gone, replaced by a dull hum of machinery, the quiet hum of heaters working against the cold. Kevin moved quickly, laying Ellis down on a cot in the corner of the small shelter. He peeled back the layers of ice-stiffened fabric around her, checking her breathing, pressing gloved fingers against the side of her neck. His expression darkened. Saran stood frozen by the door, barely breathing, her body rigid with uncertainty. Her mind screamed at her to do something, but she didn't know what. She was too young to understand injuries, too small to lift her mother, too afraid to make a mistake that might cost her everything. She hated feeling useless. Kevin's voice cut through the panic, threatening to rise in her chest. "She's cold, too cold." Saran clenched her fists. Of course she was cold. They had been in the storm for hours. Did this human think she didn't know that? But Kevin wasn't looking at her with pity or dismissal. He was focused, assessing the situation with an intensity that made her feel like he cared, not just about whether her mother lived or died, but about the fact that this mattered to Saran. That, more than anything, made her hesitate. Humans weren't supposed to care. Kevin pulled a blanket from his storage compartment and draped it over Ellis. Then, without looking up, he spoke again. "You should sit." Saran stiffened. "You're freezing," he added, voice softer but no less firm. "And you're not going to be any help to her if you collapse." Saran glared at him, unwilling to admit that her legs were trembling beneath her, that her hands were so numb she could barely feel them. She didn't want to sit. She didn't want to rest. She wanted her mother to wake up. She wanted to understand why this was happening. She wanted to go home. But home was gone. The weight of that truth settled over her like a second layer of ice. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered herself onto the floor beside the cot. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, watching. Kevin was careful as he worked, his movements efficient, precise, not rushed but not slow either. He pulled a small device from his belt and pressed it against Ellis's neck. A quiet beep filled the room. He frowned. "Her body temperature is too low. We need to get it up or she's not going to wake up." Saran tensed. "What are you going to do?" Kevin hesitated, as if considering how to phrase his answer. "Heat packs for now." He pulled several from his bag and activated them, tucking them gently beneath the blanket covering Ellis. "It'll help, but it's not enough." Saran's heart pounded. "Then what?" Kevin exhaled through his nose, thinking, calculating. "I'll figure it out." Saran clenched her fists tighter. That wasn't an answer. That wasn't something she could hold on to. But what choice did she have? Kevin rose to his feet, running a hand through his dark, slightly damp hair. He was watching Ellis closely, his sharp gaze flickering between her shallow breaths and the slow rise and fall of her chest. Saran didn't know what to make of him. She had spent her whole life hearing about humans, how they were reckless, how they only thought about themselves, how they were built for destruction. But this man had carried her mother through a storm. He had brought them here. He was trying. That didn't make sense. She didn't trust him, not yet, maybe not ever, but she couldn't ignore what she had seen. Minutes passed in silence. Then, at last, her mother stirred. Saran was on her feet before she realized she had moved. "Mama." Ellis didn't open her eyes, but a faint, barely audible sound slipped from her lips. Her fingers twitched. The tension in Kevin's shoulders eased slightly. "She's stable, for now." He turned, finally looking at Saran directly. "She needs rest, you do too." Saran didn't argue, couldn't. Her body betrayed her, exhaustion creeping in now that the immediate danger had passed. The warmth of the shelter made her limbs feel heavier, her eyelids droop. Kevin reached behind him and pulled another blanket from his pack. He didn't hand it to her, just draped it over her shoulders without a word. Saran flinched. The fabric was warm, too warm after hours in the cold, but she didn't shake it off. She shouldn't have accepted it, shouldn't have let this human do anything for her, but as she curled up beside her mother's cot, her small hands gripping the edge of the blanket, she didn't push him away. Kevin didn't say anything else. He just sat down across the room, leaning back against the wall, arms crossed, watching over them. Saran's last thought before sleep pulled her under was quiet, uncertain. Maybe, just maybe, humans weren't what she had been told. Kevin had spent too many years surviving to ignore the signs of a hunt, the way the wind carried an unnatural stillness, the way his gut twisted with that instinctive warning before danger struck. He had learned to listen, but he didn't need instinct alone this time. The console's blinking red markers were all the confirmation he needed. They weren't just being followed. They were being hunted. He exhaled through his nose, quiet but deliberate, forcing his breathing to stay slow and even. It hadn't been difficult to figure out. The girl had said little, barely speaking beyond answering his immediate questions, but he had seen the terror in her eyes. That kind of fear wasn't born from the cold. It wasn't just from being lost in a storm. It came from being prey. And the way she had reacted when he told her they had company, that single whispered word, "them," had told him everything he needed to know. Saran and her mother weren't just lost. They were running from something. He didn't know the whole story, not yet. But what he did know was this: whoever was chasing them was still coming. Kevin's grip tightened around his rifle as he turned away from the console, scanning the small shelter. Ellis was still unconscious, her breathing steadier now, but her face still pale, her dark hair damp with lingering cold. She wasn't in any shape to run. That complicated things. Saran was watching him, barely moving, her small frame stiff with tension. Her wide, violet eyes flicked between him and the sealed entrance, and Kevin could see the battle playing out inside her head. She didn't trust him, not completely, but she was starting to. He crouched in front of her, keeping his voice steady, low. "They were after you before you got caught in that storm." It wasn't a question. Saran hesitated, her fingers curling around the edges of the blanket still draped over her shoulders. "Why?" Kevin pressed. She swallowed, her throat bobbing. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, but then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Because we ran away." Kevin nodded slowly, his mind piecing things together. He had figured as much, but that didn't tell him why. From what? Saran's small hands clenched into fists. She was silent for a long moment before answering, her voice shaking but determined. "From them, the Dominion." Kevin felt something cold settle in his gut. The Dominion. He had dealt with their kind before, officers, enforcers, the kind of people who didn't just hunt you down but erased you from existence when they finally caught you. Ruthless, organized, and thorough. If they wanted someone dead, that person usually didn't get a second chance. Kevin kept his expression neutral. He didn't need Saran seeing the concern creeping into his mind. "Why are they after you?" he asked. Saran bit her lip. She looked at her mother, still motionless, as if waiting for her to wake up and take this burden from her. When Ellis didn't move, Saran drew in a shaky breath. Because of my mother, she admitted. She used to work for them. Kevin frowned. Used to. Saran nodded. She left. She said they were doing bad things. She wanted to stop them. Of course, that explained everything. Someone high-ranking enough to know what the Dominion was really doing and then try to leave. That was a death sentence. Kevin exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. So Ellis was a defector, a fugitive. That meant the Dominion wouldn't stop. They wouldn't lose her in a storm and assume she had died. They would keep searching until they found the body, which meant they were going to keep coming. Kevin shifted, glancing back at the console. The motion markers were closer now. How long have they been chasing you? He asked. Days, Saran murmured. She rubbed her arms, suddenly looking smaller. We had a ship, but they found us. We barely got out. We've been running since. Kevin nodded, filing away that information. If their ship had been compromised, then the Dominion had likely tracked its last coordinates right to this planet. And your father? He asked carefully. Saran shook her head. They killed him. A beat of silence. Kevin didn't press. He didn't need to. The pain in her voice told him everything. Saran's arms wrapped around herself, but her gaze didn't waver. She was afraid, of course she was, but there was something else in her expression now. Determination. Even if she was just a child, she understood what was happening. She wasn't naive enough to think they could hide forever. Kevin exhaled sharply, rising to his feet. All right, that's enough for now. We need to move. Saran looked at her mother again. She's not strong enough. She doesn't have to be, Kevin cut in. I'll carry her, you just stay close. Saran hesitated, then nodded. Kevin didn't waste time. He grabbed his gear, secured his rifle over his shoulder, and moved to lift Ellis. She barely stirred as he adjusted her weight against his chest. Let's go. Saran followed, her small footsteps barely making a sound as Kevin led them toward the back of the shelter where the maintenance hatch waited. The console let out a sharp beep. Kevin turned his head sharply, eyes narrowing at the screen. The motion markers had closed in too fast. He tensed. They're already here, no more time. He hit the hatch's release, and the door hissed open, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel beneath the structure. The air inside was stale, heavy with damp ice and a faint metallic tang of old mining equipment. Saran hesitated. Kevin didn't. He stepped inside, shifting Ellis against him, then reached out. Come on. Saran's small hand gripped his sleeve. She stepped into the tunnel and Kevin sealed the hatch behind them. Darkness swallowed them. Above, a metallic clang echoed through the shelter as the Dominion soldiers breached the entrance. Saran stiffened, pressing close to Kevin. He could feel her shaking, but she didn't make a sound. Good girl. Kevin clicked on his rifle's light, casting a narrow beam through the tunnel's depths. Stay quiet, he murmured, and stay close. Saran nodded. Then, without another word, Kevin started moving. Behind them, the hunt had begun. Kevin's mind worked fast, too fast. Years of instinct honed on battlefields and backwater planets told him exactly how this would play out. If they didn't move, if they hesitated, the Dominion wouldn't just storm the shelter. They would tear it apart, room by room, sector by sector, until nothing remained. A locked hatch wouldn't stop them. Walls wouldn't stop them. The only option was to disappear. His grip tightened around Ellis's unconscious body as his free hand moved toward the maintenance hatch at the back of the shelter. It was an old mining shaft, unstable, freezing, and barely functional, but it was an exit. It was their only exit. Saran stood frozen, her violet eyes wide with fear. Kevin didn't have time to explain, to comfort her. He needed her to move. Saran, his voice was steady but firm. We can't stay here, do you understand? She blinked at him, her small hands gripping the edges of the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She was terrified, but there was something else beneath it, something sharp, something that knew exactly what would happen if they stayed. She nodded. Kevin exhaled, pressing the hatch's release panel. The lock disengaged with a soft hiss, revealing a black, gaping void beneath them. A rush of cold air seeped in, sharp and biting, carrying the scent of damp metal and stale oxygen. Saran hesitated. Come on, kid. Kevin crouched down, adjusting Ellis's weight against him. I need you to go first. I'll be right behind you. Saran looked at the tunnel's entrance, then back at him. Her entire life she had been told not to trust humans, but Kevin had carried her mother through a storm. He had given her warmth, given her a chance. She swallowed hard and stepped forward. Kevin watched as she lowered herself into the tunnel, small hands gripping the frozen ladder rungs. He waited until she was a few steps down before following, shifting Ellis carefully as he climbed. Above them, the console let out a sharp beep. Kevin's heart pounded. The Dominion had breached the outer doors. They were out of time. As soon as he was inside, he reached up and hit the panel beside the hatch. The metal door slid shut, cutting off the dim glow of the shelter above, sealing them inside the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. The tunnel stretched ahead, a narrow corridor of ice-coated walls and rusted metal supports. The cold was relentless, creeping through Kevin's gear, biting at his exposed skin. Saran flinched at the sound, her fingers tightening in the fabric of Kevin's jacket. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Kevin could feel the weight of her fear as if it were his own. We're almost clear, he murmured, keeping his voice low but firm. Just a little further. She nodded, though her expression remained tense. Kevin could hear the subtle shifts in the air, the way sound carried through the tunnels. If the Dominion had a tracker with them, it was only a matter of time before they picked up their trail. They needed to disappear. A faint tremor ran through Ellis's body, barely perceptible, but Kevin felt it. It was the first sign of movement from her since they had left the shelter. Saran, he said quietly, his voice calm but intent, talk to her, keep her with us. Saran blinked up at him. Hope flickered in her expression. She let go of his coat and moved closer, reaching for her mother's hand. Mama! The word was so small, so fragile, that for a moment Kevin wasn't sure Ellis would respond. Then a breath, a slow, unsteady inhale, and her fingers twitched. Saran sucked in a sharp breath. She's waking up. Kevin didn't slow down, but his grip on Ellis shifted slightly, adjusting her weight. He could feel the faint tension in her muscles now, the slow return of consciousness. Ellis, he said, his voice steady, you with us. A weak sound, barely more than a whisper, then finally her eyes opened. For a moment she was unfocused, disoriented, the dim light of the tunnel reflected in her dark, glassy eyes, confusion flickering across her face. She was still too weak to move, but her gaze shifted, searching, finding Saran. Saran let out a small, choked sound, half a sob, half a breath of relief. Mama, you're okay. Kevin felt the moment Ellis registered where she was. Her body tensed slightly, instinct preparing her to fight or flee. Easy, Kevin murmured, his grip adjusting just enough to remind her that he was still carrying her. You're safe, for now. Her gaze snapped to him then, her dark eyes sharpening despite the haze of exhaustion. Kevin met her stare without hesitation. She didn't speak, but he could see it, the immediate calculation, the silent demand for answers. Who are you? Where are we? What happened? Saran answered first. He saved us, Mama. He carried you through the storm. Ellis's expression didn't soften, but something in her gaze shifted. Recognition. You kept us alive, she murmured, her voice weak. Kevin shrugged slightly, adjusting his grip on her as he kept moving. Didn't feel like letting you freeze to death. There was a pause then, so faint Kevin almost missed it. A ghost of a smile flickered across her lips. But it was gone in an instant. Where are we? She asked, her voice stronger now. Underground, Kevin answered. Old mining tunnels. We've got about 2 more minutes before the Dominion realizes we're not topside anymore. Ellis's breath caught slightly, her body tensing. They followed us. Did you think they wouldn't? Kevin shot her a sharp look. They want you dead. They're not going to just walk away. Ellis closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. Then we need to keep moving. That was the plan. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the danger, the fact that she was still barely conscious, Ellis shifted, trying to pull herself upright. Kevin narrowed his eyes. What do you think you're doing? Walking, she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. Kevin snorted, not a chance. Ellis glared at him, a real glare, not hazy confusion, not half-conscious distress, an actual, fully aware glare. Kevin had to admit he was impressed. "I can walk," she insisted. "Yeah, that why you're still in my arms." Her jaw tightened. Kevin smirked. "Thought so." Saran made a small noise, almost like a giggle. Ellis sighed, closing her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, there was something different in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but something close. "Fine," she muttered, "but don't get used to it." Kevin chuckled under his breath. "Wouldn't dream of it." He kept moving, Saran at his side, Ellis in his arms. The tunnel stretched ahead into the dark. Behind them, the enemies searched. But for the first time since this all began, they were together. The tunnel was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of Kevin's rifle. The cold air pressed against them, thick and heavy with the weight of exhaustion. They had been running for too long. Kevin could still feel the warmth of Ellis's hand on his arm from earlier. She had touched him without thinking, and he had let her. But now, as they finally stopped to catch their breath, the silence between them changed. Ellis wasn't looking at him. She was watching him, studying him, and Kevin knew she had questions. "You're not just some wanderer, are you?" Her voice was quiet but sharp, cutting like a knife pressed just beneath the skin. Kevin exhaled slowly, shifting his grip on his rifle. "What makes you say that?" Ellis's jaw tightened. "You don't fight like a soldier," she said. "You don't talk like one either, but you know how they move. You predicted how the Dominion would track us. You knew exactly how to disappear. That's not something you just pick up traveling the galaxy." Kevin didn't answer because she was right. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Saran, sitting a few feet away, was watching too, small hands clenched into fists, violet eyes wide with worry. Ellis's voice dropped lower. "Who are you, Kevin?" Kevin ran a hand through his hair, let out a slow breath. There was no point in lying, not to them. "I wasn't a soldier," he admitted. "Not really." Ellis didn't blink. "Then what were you?" Kevin hesitated, then forced himself to say it. "I was an infiltrator." A long, cold pause. Ellis's expression didn't change, but he saw the shift in her eyes. "You were." "I tracked people," Kevin interrupted before she could finish. "Ran operations for the Dominion, found rebels, defectors, deserters. I didn't kill them, but I made sure someone else could." His voice was steady, too steady. Saran sucked in a breath. Ellis's hands curled into fists. "So you hunted people like us." Kevin felt that right in his ribs, right in the place where the guilt lived. "Yes." A heavy silence settled over them. Saran moved closer to Ellis, small fingers wrapping around her mother's arm. Ellis didn't push her away, didn't look away from Kevin. "Did you ever track anyone like me?" Ellis asked, her voice quiet. Kevin met her gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I wouldn't be surprised." The weight of his past crushed against him. He could see it now, a younger version of himself walking through Dominion corridors, standing at attention as officers gave him his next target, a name, a location. He had never asked questions, not until it was too late. "Why did you leave?" Ellis asked. Kevin let out a slow breath. "Because I caught the wrong person." Ellis frowned. Kevin's jaw tightened. He had never told this story before. "I was sent to track a rebel, standard mission. They said he was dangerous, wanted for attacks against Dominion forces. I found him easily, followed him for weeks, tracked him to some backwater colony where he was hiding with his family." Ellis's expression darkened. "His family?" Kevin nodded. "Wife, kid, a little younger than Saran." Saran's small fingers curled into Ellis's coat. "That was the first time I hesitated," Kevin continued. "I had done this job for years, but I had never seen that side of it. I had never seen what happened after I made the call." He looked away. "I made the call anyway." Ellis inhaled sharply. Kevin clenched his fists. "And then I watched as the Dominion executed him in front of his wife and son." Silence. "That was the last time I made a call." He didn't look at them, didn't want to see their expressions. "I ran after that, took whatever I could carry and disappeared. Spent the next few years hopping from system to system, staying off the grid, doing whatever it took to survive. When I found this planet, I thought I could finally stop running." A humorless chuckle left his lips. "Guess that was a stupid idea." The silence stretched, heavy with something Kevin couldn't name. Then Ellis moved, not to hit him, not to shove him away. She just sat down beside him. Saran watched her mother carefully, then crawled over to Kevin and sat down too. Kevin blinked. You left, Ella said. That matters. Kevin huffed a small, bitter laugh. Not enough. Maybe not, Ellis agreed. But if you were still that man, you wouldn't be here. Kevin turned to her then, really looking at her. Ellis met his gaze. You saved us. You could have turned us in, could have walked away at any time. Saran, small and quiet, nodded. Kevin felt his throat tighten. So what are you now? Ellis asked. Kevin exhaled. I don't know, he admitted. Ellis studied him for a long moment. Then finally she gave a small nod. Then figure it out, she said, but do it with us. Kevin swallowed past the sudden tightness in his chest. Saran, still curled up beside him, grabbed his hand in both of hers. Okay, Kevin murmured. Ellis nodded once, standing up. Come on, she said, offering him a hand. We still have a war to survive. Kevin stared at her for a second, then with a slow, careful movement, he took her hand. She pulled him to his feet, steadying him as he swayed slightly. One step at a time, Ellis murmured. Kevin let out a breath and smirked. You're getting sentimental on me, sweetheart. Ellis rolled her eyes. Shut up and start walking. Kevin chuckled, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running anymore. Kevin's breathing was slow but steady, even as pain flared through his side. The wound wasn't fatal, he had taken worse, but he could feel the warmth of blood seeping into his shirt, the dull ache settling deep into his muscles. He had saved Ellis. That was all that mattered. Ellis's hands pressed against the wound, her fingers coated in his blood. Her dark eyes burned with something fierce, something raw. You're an idiot, she muttered, her voice shaking just enough to betray her emotions. Kevin smirked despite himself. I get that a lot. That's not funny. A little funny. Ellis let out a slow breath, her jaw tightening as she worked to slow the bleeding. Saran hovered beside them, her small hands gripping Kevin's sleeve, her violet eyes wide and desperate. Is he going to die? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Kevin reached out, ruffling her dark hair with blood-stained fingers. Not today, kid. Saran let out a shaky breath, clinging to his arm a little tighter. Ellis wasn't convinced. Her hands moved quickly, expertly securing a piece of fabric around his side. He felt the pressure tighten, the pain sharp but necessary. She had done this before, not just battlefield wounds, this kind of wound, a gunshot. She had seen people die like this before. Kevin watched her as she worked, his gaze steady. You know, you could just admit you're worried about me. She didn't look up. You could just stop making me worry. Kevin chuckled, a mistake. The movement sent a sharp jolt of pain through his ribs, and Ellis pressed harder on the wound in retaliation. You're lucky I don't have a knife in my hand, she muttered. I'd still be charming, Kevin countered. Ellis glared at him, but there was no real heat behind it. Just exhaustion, just frustration, just fear. Kevin hated seeing that in her eyes. We need to move, she said finally. That shot, they'll have heard it. She was right. Even now, the tunnel was too quiet, the silence pressing in around them like a living thing. The Dominion soldiers wouldn't stop.